Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Now, if you follow politics in the U.S., you're constantly faced with this two-party system. It just dominates everything.
It really does. It's hard to see outside of it sometimes.
But standing firmly outside that structure, decade after decade, you've got the Green Party of the United States, the GPUS.
Yep, it's still there.
So our mission today is to look past the usual horse race, the election coverage, and really try to understand this organization. Where did it come from? What's its core, non-negotiable ideology? And maybe the biggest question, why does it keep going, despite, let's face it, a long history of national electoral challenges?
Right. It's not just about analyzing, vote total.
Exactly. We're aiming for a deep dive into a whole political philosophy here.
And I think to really get the GPUS, you have to start with this core tension. It's something the source material really highlights well.
Okay, what's that?
It's this paradox. Structurally, organizationally, they're what gets called a Reala party. They register, they try to get on the ballot, they run candidates, they play the game, so to speak.
They operate within the existing system.
But, and this is the key, ideologically, fundamentally, they're a fundi party. That means fundamentalist, movement-based, really uncompromisingly anti-establishment in their core beliefs.
So real structure, fundi soul.
Pretty much sums it up. And this internal conflict, this split between needing to exist in the system pragmatically and philosophically wanting to, dismantle that system, that's the lens. You have to see everything they do, all their policies, through that lens.
That's fascinating. An organization basically built to run for office, but committed to a philosophy that rejects the whole framework of those offices.
It explains a lot.
We've pulled together some analytical reports for this. They detail the party's, frankly, quite turbulent origins, the specific details of its eco-socialist framework. We'll definitely get into that. And crucially, the deep structural reasons why they find themselves just completely at odds with both the Democrats and the Republicans.
Yeah, the differences are, fundamental, not just matters of degree.
Okay, let's unpack that history then. Because, like you said, most people probably only think about the Green Party when a presidential election rolls around. Maybe Nader in 2000.
Right. Nader is the big touchstone for many.
But the movement itself, its ideas, its organization, it goes way back into the 80s. Tell us about those very first steps. Where did it formally begin?
It formally kicked off, according to the sources, in August 1984, St. Paul, Minnesota. That's when they founded the Committees of Correspondence, or
Committees of Correspondence, that name rings a bell. The American Revolution, right?
Exactly. And that was completely deliberate. It's a piece of signaling. By using that name, they weren't positioning themselves as just another minor political party or lobby group.
No, it sounds much bigger than that.
They were framing themselves as the precursor to a total structural revolution. An organization designed to share information, coordinate resistance across different areas, just like the original committees did before 1776.
Wow. Okay, so ambitious from day one. What was the initial group like?
Ideologically cohesive.
Oh, definitely not cohesive. Not at all. The initial coalition was about 62 activists, but they came from everywhere. Veterans of the women's movement, civil rights, peace activists, justice advocates, community organizers, various environmental thinkers.
It's a real mix.
A huge mix. And that immediately led to this defining ideological diversity. You had people pushing social ecology, others deep ecology, ecofeminism. You had anarchists in the room, various kinds of socialists, all under one kind of tent.
That sounds potentially explosive. How do anarchists and socialists and deep ecologists even agree on how to organize anything?
Well, that's the point. They often didn't. And that created the very first core tension, this question of decentralization. How should they structure themselves?
Well,
on one side, you had people arguing for coordinated decentralization. They wanted a structured organization, something that could actually do outreach, maybe eventually become a national political force. They thought, organization equals effectiveness.
makes sense. And the other side?
The other side argued for radical decentralization. They were really strongly against any formal structure. They just wanted a loose, informal network for sharing information. For them, the very act of creating a formal organization with rules and officers was a betrayal of their anti-hierarchical principles.
So that core argument, how formal should we be, becomes the party versus movement debate pretty quickly.
Exactly. By 1987, they held a national green gathering, and these arguments really crystallized. The debates were explicitly framed as party versus movement, and also, very significantly, deep ecology versus social ecology.
Right, let's pause on that second one. Deep ecology versus social ecology. That seems crucial for understanding how they see the world. What's the key difference there?
It's fundamental. Deep ecology is primarily biocentric. Its main focus is on the inherent value of all non-human life. Sometimes its proponents advocate for things like radical population reduction, and they tend to see humanity as just one species among many, maybe even a uniquely destructive one.
Okay, nature first, humans maybe second.
Kind of. Social ecology, on the other hand, which was really championed by thinkers like Murray Bookchin, argues that the ecological crisis isn't about humans inherently, but about social hierarchy.
Ah, so human systems are the problem.
Yes. The root causes of environmental destruction for social ecologists aren't things like technology or population size in themselves, but human systems of domination, capitalism, patriarchy, the centralized state. So social ecologists believed you have to dismantle human hierarchies first, or at least simultaneously, to save the planet.
Got it. So if you lean towards social ecology, you'd probably want a political movement focused on structure, on social justice. If you lean towards deep ecology, you might be really suspicious of any big human organization, right?
Precisely. And that tension played out directly in their first attempt at a national organization. In 1991, they founded the Greens Green Party USA, GGP USA, in West Virginia. It was this very unstable compromise agreement trying to hold both views.
How do they try to structure it?
They tried to base it around these highly autonomous local chapters, the Green Local, and these kind of vague bioregion units, very decentralized.
But that decentralized structure, based on principle, ultimately didn't work for actually running in elections, did it? Why not?
Well, because of that ideological purity, frankly, the GGP USA structure led to this sort of active hostility towards the practical mechanics you need to engage with in the U.S. political system.
Like what? Filing deadlines? Ballot access laws?
Exactly. Running a national campaign, or even just getting on the ballot in multiple states, requires dealing with state-level bureaucracy, endless legal filings, specific fundraising rules. Many in the GGP USA saw engaging with all that stuff as detrimental to the movement's pure decentralized spirit. They philosophically objected to jumping through the very hoops required to participate in the system they wanted to change.
And then comes Ralph Nader's 1996 presidential campaign, which kind of throws this whole inadequacy into sharp relief.
Nader 96 was absolutely the catalyst. Suddenly, there was real popular interest, a need for effective, coordinated national support. And the GGP USA, with its decentralized, anti-bureaucratic setup, just couldn't deliver. It wasn't built for it.
So the more pragmatic, election-focused members realized they needed something different.
They did. They realized if they actually wanted to compete, even a little bit, they needed an organization designed to navigate the existing system, not one that was actively trying to ignore its rules.
And this is where the ReLO faction really starts to organize itself.
Yes. So in November 1996, Greens from 30 states got together and formed the Association of State Green Parties, ASGP. This was the explicitly pragmatic wing, the direct organizational ancestor of today's GPUS.
And their goals were purely practical.
Totally practical, totally structural. Two main goals. One, help develop actual functioning state green parties. Two, create a legally structured national green party, specifically to get ballot access across the country. They were basically saying, we're tired of waiting for the movement purists to get okay with filing paperwork.
And the GDP USA, the original group, how did they react? They came up with a label for this split, didn't they?
They did. They formally called it the Fundy-Relo split. GGP USA positioned themselves as the Fundy wing fundamentalist, committed to movement purity above all. The ASGP was labeled the Relo wing realist, focused on electoral pragmatism.
Fundy versus ReLO. That's stark.
And then came the 2000 Nader the Duke campaign. That was run entirely by the ASGP, the ReLO group. It brought in thousands of new people who were excited about running candidates and, maybe even winning some elections, not just having decentralized discussion groups. The sources say this campaign fundamentally transformed the Green Party, shifting its center of gravity toward electoral work.
So the ASGP is gaining momentum, running these campaigns. Yeah, how did the Fundy side, the GGP USA, manage to block a merger if the energy was shifting?
Well, that leads us to the final break. In 2001, there was something called the Boston Agreement. It was this negotiated plan to finally merge the two groups, the ASGP and the GGP USA.
Okay, a path to unity.
It seemed like it. The ASGP, the Realos, approved it, but it needed a 2/3 supermajority vote at the GGP-USA Congress, and it failed to pass.
Wow, they voted it down.
They did. The fundee faction held firm. They chose essentially ideological purity over structural unity and electoral pragmatism. They refused the compromise.
So what did the ASGP do then? Just accept defeat?
Not at all. They acted unilaterally and decisively. In July 2001, the ASGP just went ahead and changed its name to the Green Party of the United States, GPUS. And crucially, they successfully applied for and got National Committee status from the Federal Election Commission, the FEC.
So they became the official legally recognized Green Party at the national level.
Exactly. That meant they were the entity for national fundraising, for coordinating ballot access efforts. The GGP-USA basically lost its affiliates, lost its influence pretty rapidly after that, and eventually dissolved some years later.
So the modern GPUS we see today is really born from this internal divorce, this schism. How does that turbulent history shape its identity now?
It creates that core paradox we started with. The GPUS has the structure of a reload party. It's set up to run campaigns, deal with the FEC, get on ballots, but it inherited and, importantly, retained the deeply radical ideological platform of its fundee ancestors, the movement purists.
So it uses the tools of the system
To promote a worldview that's designed to fundamentally challenge and ultimately, they hope, replace that very system. It's a fascinating dynamic.
Right, and understanding that history is so important.
Yeah.
Because without it, if you just look at the GPUS platform, it might seem like, I don't know, just a random collection of progressive wish list items.
Yeah, disconnected ideas.
But it's not.
Yeah.
Every single policy, really, flows directly from that fundee ideological DNA we were just talking about.
Yeah.
So let's dig into their core beliefs, their sort of ethical compass.
Okay. The party's entire philosophy, according to their own materials, is anchored by the 4 pillars. These are peace, which includes nonviolence, ecological wisdom, social justice, and grassroots democracy.
And these aren't just slogans for them.
No, not at all. They function as real, non-negotiable, ethical red lines. Every policy proposal, every strategic decision is supposedly judged against these 4 pillars. They're foundational.
Okay, 4 pillars, but then they expand on that, right, into something called the 10 key values. That seems like a much more detailed blueprint.
It is. The 10 key values get more specific, and several of them are really critical for understanding their structural choices and their economic stance.
Which ones stand out?
Well, ecological wisdom is huge, obviously. It demands that human societies operate strictly within ecological limits. That fundamentally rejects the whole idea of perpetual economic growth that, both major parties basically take for granted.
Okay, limits to growth. What else?
Grassroots democracy. This mandates direct citizen participation. It emphasizes local decision-making, empowering communities, rather than far-off, centralized power structures, whether government or corporate.
So power down to the local level, how does that translate into their economic thinking?
That really comes through in 2 other values: decentralization and community-based economics. Decentralization is about actively shifting power away from what they call the powerful few, corporate boardrooms, Washington, D.C., and moving it towards the local level, towards communities.
And community-based economics.
That gets specific about how things should be owned and run. It calls for things like employee ownership and workplace democracy. It's explicitly about restricting the concentrated power of corporations.
Okay, so we're seeing the anti-corporate, pro-local theme building here. But before we get to their big economic idea, this eco-socialism, we absolutely have to talk about the single most defining structural decision the GPUS makes, the one that basically guarantees they can't play the same game as the Democrats or Republicans.
Yes. Campaign finance.
Exactly. Tell us about their rule.
This is probably the purest expression of that fundee DNA asserting itself. The rule is simple and absolute. The GPUS does not accept donations from corporations, political action committees, PCs, 527c organizations, or soft money, full stop.
No corporate money, no PAC money, period. Why is this refusal so central to who they are and why they keep going?
Because, in their analysis, corporate money isn't just a side issue, it's the root cause of political corruption and dysfunction in the U.S. They believe that true democracy, and certainly ecological wisdom, are made impossible when corporations finance campaigns.
So taking the money is seen as inherently corrupting.
Yes. They argue that accepting corporate money, even small amounts, signals an acceptance of corporate legitimacy and inevitably leads to the capture of the political system by those corporate interests. So they've made a conscious choice. They'd rather be structurally underfunded and face huge electoral disadvantages than cross that fundamental ethical line. It's non-negotiable for them.
Okay, so they reject the funding mechanisms of capitalism entirely. And then, as you mentioned, they also formally rejected both traditional capitalism and traditional state socialism back in 2016. What's the alternative they're proposing, this ecological socialism?
Right. They advocate for an alternative system they describe using a few different terms. Ecological socialism, sometimes communalism, or the cooperative commonwealth. But the key descriptor they use, which is really important, is that they define this framework explicitly as libertarian socialist.
Okay, libertarian socialist.
Yeah.
Now, that term could be confusing for a lot of listeners, especially in the American context, where libertarian usually means something very different, very right-wing, market-focused. How are the Greens using it here?
Yeah, it's a critical distinction. In this context, libertarian socialist means they reject both capitalist control of the economy and centralized top-down state control. Think Soviet-style state socialism, they reject that too.
So anti-corporate and anti-big government bureaucracy.
Exactly. They're aiming for worker control and community control over the economy. It's fundamentally an anti-authoritarian framework. The goal is radical democracy, not just in how we vote, but in how our economy is owned and run. Power should be held by the people who are actually doing the work and living in the communities affected by economic decisions.
So what would this economy actually look like? If it's not purely market-driven and it's not state-run, what's the structure?
They envision a mixed economy, but mixed in a very different way than we usually think of it. It would have three main sectors. First, a large sector of democratically controlled public enterprises.
Meaning?
Think about things like nationalized energy grids, utilities, mass transportation systems, maybe even large banks. But critically, these wouldn't be run by central government bureaucrats in Washington. They'd be managed through things like worker councils and community oversight boards, democracy baked into the structure.
Okay, that's sector one. What's two?
Sector two would be a large sector of cooperative enterprises. So businesses that are owned and managed democratically by the people who work there, or sometimes by the consumers who use their services. Think worker co-ops, credit unions, consumer co-ops.
And the third sector?
The third sector would be smaller. It would consist of small, privately owned businesses and self-employed individuals. But these would likely operate mostly in niche markets, not dominating core sectors of the economy like they do now.
This sounds like it leads directly to another core concept you hear from them. Decommodification. What does that mean in practice?
Decommodification is absolutely central, especially to their social justice pillar. The idea is, if the economy is democratically controlled, its primary goal shouldn't be maximizing profit. It should be meeting human needs.
So take basic necessities out of the market.
Precisely. They argue that basic human needs should be provided as a right, meaning they should be free at the point of service or nearly free. So that means things like universal, free healthcare, free education from pre-K through college, free childcare, free urban mass transit.
Wow, free.
Funded through progressive taxation and the public enterprises we mentioned. Additionally, they advocate for things like low-cost public housing, public power, and clean water. The core idea is to remove these essential services entirely from the profit motive that drives the capitalist market. They shouldn't be commodities you buy and sell.
What's really striking here is just how definitive their rejection of the current system is. Why can't they just, work to fix capitalism? Better regulations, higher taxes, like many progressives advocate.
Because they've reached a fundamental conclusion. They believe that the inhumane imperial logic of a capitalist market system isn't just flawed, it's the actual undeniable root cause of both ecological devastation and social injustice.
The system itself is the problem.
Yes. In their view, capitalism structurally requires infinite growth, which is impossible on a finite planet. And it inherently creates hierarchies, exploitation, and concentrates power. Therefore, any proposed solution, including the kind favored by many Democrats, which tries to work within that capitalist market framework via regulations or incentives, is seen by the Greens as inherently insufficient. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a fundamentally broken system. They believe it's cosmetic and ultimately doomed to fail both people and the planet.
And that conclusion, that capitalism itself is the core problem. That's really the source of this deep, irreconcilable divide we mentioned earlier, especially with the Democratic Party.
Absolutely. When the GPUS looks at the Democrats, the disagreement isn't just about, say, wanting more environmental regulation or a slightly higher minimum wage. It's about wanting a completely different kind of economic system.
The starting points are totally different.
Totally different. The Democrats, generally speaking, start from the premise of managing and regulating capitalism for, ideally, better outcomes and continued growth. The GPUS starts from the premise that capitalism must be replaced by an eco-socialist system, which likely involves degrowth in many sectors, and a total restructuring of ownership and power.
So when they clash on policy, it's really a clash of these underlying worldviews.
Exactly. And probably the best place to see this collision in action is around the Green New Deal.
Right. Now, the GPUS actually makes a pretty strong claim that they, or at least the broader green movement, originated the concept in U.S. politics. They trace it back to the Global Greens Network in 2006, and Green candidates talking about it long before it hit the mainstream.
Yeah, they definitely see themselves as the originators. And importantly, their version of the Green New Deal isn't just a set of policies. They describe it as a transitional set of demands, meaning steps towards their ultimate goal of eco-socialism.
So what does their plan emphasize?
It heavily emphasizes public programs and public ownership. Think massive public investment in renewable energy infrastructure owned by the public, publicly owned banks to finance the transition, huge expansion of public transit. Critically, they explicitly reject relying on Wall Street investment or creating market mechanisms that allow private corporations to profit heavily from the transition.
And their timeline is aggressive.
Extremely aggressive. They call for 100% clean, renewable energy by 2030, mandated and driven by these public power structures. It's a rapid, state-managed, but democratically managed, in their view, mobilization.
Okay, compare that to the Democratic version, especially what we've seen with things like the Inflation Reduction Act. That seems much more focused on using the market, right?
Completely different approach. The GPUS looks at the Democratic model and sees it as dangerous co-optation and dilution.
Co-optation. How so?
They see the Democratic approach as fundamentally technocentric, focused on swapping technologies and market-based. It relies heavily on things like tax credits, subsidies, loan guarantees, all incentives designed specifically to encourage private companies to invest and, importantly, to grow our economy while transitioning energy sources.
So it's like the Democrats are saying, hey, corporations, there's money to be made in saving the planet.
Pretty much. And the Greens are saying, wait a minute, the whole system that allows corporations to make massive profits by exploiting resources is what got us into this mess in the first place.
That's the core tension right there.
That's it. The GPUS critique is really sharp here. They argue the Democratic approach completely fails to challenge what they call the core imperial logic of capitalism, the drive for endless growth and profit accumulation. In their view, the Democratic Green New Deal is designed merely to replace the fossil fuel industry with the renewable energy industry, keeping the same basic structure of corporate control, market dependence, and wealth concentration intact.
So for the Greens, this watering down of the idea is actually worse than doing nothing.
In a way, yes, because it neutralizes the radical potential of the original concept. It makes people think the problem is being solved within the existing system when, according to the Greens, the system itself is the problem.
Okay, let's pivot to healthcare. Another area where that concept of decommodification we talked about creates a huge barrier with the Democrats.
Absolutely non-negotiable for the GPUS, rooted in their social justice pillar. They demand universal, single-payer Medicare for all. Not just expanding access, but creating a system where healthcare is treated as a fundamental public service, free at the point of delivery, completely removed from the profit motive.
A human right, not a commodity.
Exactly. Whereas the official Democratic Party position, while advocating for improvements, has remained centered on defending and improving the Affordable Care Act, ACA.
Right. The focus is often on lowering private insurance premiums, controlling prescription drug costs, working within that existing market structure.
Precisely. The official Democratic platform explicitly rejects eliminating private insurance in favor of a purely public, single-payer system, even though many individual progressive Democrats might support it.
And how does the GPUS view the ACA itself?
They see it fundamentally not as a progressive reform, but as a massive bailout and subsidy for the private health insurance industry. They view that industry as inherently wasteful, bureaucratic, and immoral and unnecessary middleman that adds complexity and cost simply to extract profit from people's health needs. Their question is basic. If healthcare is truly a right, why are we preserving a system that allows private companies to profit from denying care or charging exorbitant prices?
That philosophical gulf seems maybe most visually striking when you look at foreign policy and military spending connected to their peace pillar.
Oh, yeah. The peace and nonviolence pillar isn't just a vague aspiration for them, it mandates a radical shift in foreign policy. Their platform explicitly calls for a 50% cut to the U.S. defense budget.
50%? That's huge.
Massive. And coupled with that, they demand the complete closure of all U.S. military bases overseas. This flows directly from their analysis of U.S. foreign policy as fundamentally imperialistic and militaristic.
How does that square with the traditional Democratic stance on foreign policy and defense?
It's in total opposition. If you look at Democratic platforms consistently over time, they call for things like strengthening American leadership worldwide and explicitly maintaining the strongest military in the world. The source materials point to a deep, long-standing bipartisan consensus in Washington supporting very high levels of defense spending.
So even when Democrats are in power, defense spending doesn't really go down significantly.
Historically, no. It remains structurally very high, regardless of who is in the White House or controls Congress. There might be debates about how to spend it, but not about the fundamental need for massive military expenditure and global power projection.
And it's this bipartisan consensus on military spending, plus the acceptance of corporate money.
That leads the GPUS to coin that scathing label for the whole system, the two parties of war and Wall Street.
War and Wall Street. Ouch.
Their argument is that structurally, despite their differences on social issues, both major parties ultimately serve the same underlying interests, the military-industrial complex and corporate finance.
Okay, so if the Greens believe the Democrats are fundamentally committed to global military dominance and are beholden to corporate finance, how could they ever expect them to enact truly systemic reforms? This seems to lead back to their demands for electoral reform itself.
Exactly. The GPUS argues that the system itself is so warped by money and its structure that you have to basically demolish and rebuild the electoral system before any meaningful policy change on things like climate or healthcare can actually happen and stick.
So what kind of structural changes are they calling for?
Really fundamental ones. They want to rescue democracy, as they put it. This includes things like implementing proportional representation for legislative bodies, which would break the two-party stranglehold, abolishing the Electoral College, enacting ranked choice voting, RCV, nationwide, and, crucially, implementing full public financing of presidential campaigns, which would obviously align with their own no corporate money rule.
And the Democrats. While they might support things like voting rights protection or maybe some lobbying reform.
But they generally do not challenge the really fundamental structures like the Electoral College or the winner-take-all plurality voting system that props up the two-party duopoly.
Why not, according to the Green analysis?
Well, the GPUS conclusion is pretty stark. They argue that the Democratic Party's very reliance on corporate funding for its campaigns and its electoral success within the current winner-take-all system makes it structurally incapable of seriously pushing for the kind of deep reforms, especially proportional representation, that would dismantle its own power and the power of the two-party system. Why would one half of a successful monopoly vote to break up the monopoly? It doesn't make strategic sense from their perspective.
Okay, so if the Green critique of the Democrats is about co-optation, dilution, and being structurally bound to the system, the critique of the Republican Party seems entirely different. The sources suggest it's less about competition and more about, well, fundamental opposition.
That's a good way to put it. The disagreement with the Democrats, while deep, often happens within a broadly shared, liberal framework about goals, even if the means are different. The disagreement with the Republican Party, particularly the modern GOP, is often about the nature of reality itself, about fundamental morality. It's an existential gulf.
Let's start with the obvious one, giving your name.
Yeah.
The Green Party. Ecological wisdom is pillar number one for them.
It's literally their raison d'etre, their reason for being. Climate change isn't just an issue for them, it's the existential crisis requiring a total restructuring of society based on that ecological wisdom pillar.
And the Republican Party.
The modern GOP platform and actions are largely defined by actively pro-fossil fuel policies, a push for massive deregulation of environmental protections, and maybe most critically, an active hostility towards the established science of climate change.
How deep does that hostility run?
It runs very deep. You frequently hear prominent Republican leaders dismissing climate action as a Green New scam or questioning the severity or even the existence of human-caused climate change, sometimes calling it a hoax.
So it's not even a debate about the best solution anymore.
For the GPUS looking at the GOP, no. It's often a disagreement about whether the problem even exists in the way scientists describe it. There's just no common ground there on basic facts, risk assessment, or the urgency needed. It's a clash with denial from the Green perspective.
And that same kind of existential gulf appears on issues of social justice, too.
Just as vast, if not more so. The GPOS platform, rooted in its social justice and peace pillars, demands a huge expansion of the social safety net, decommodified healthcare, housing, education, as we discussed. And they explicitly support really assertive social justice positions, things like reparations for the descendants of enslaved people, unequivocal support for Black Lives Matter, full reproductive rights, including abortion access, full LGBTQ+ rights.
Again, how does that compare to the GOP platform?
It's almost a mirror image in opposition. The GOP platform emphasizes social conservatism, stressing the sanctity of innocent human life, which informs their opposition to abortion rights. And their economic model is built on deregulation, tax cuts, especially for corporations and the wealthy, and generally viewing a large social safety net not as a social good, but as a drag on economic growth and individual responsibility.
So for the GPUS, the Republican platform isn't just wrong,
It represents, in their view, the sort of unvarnished, unmasked, toxic logic of the capitalist, patriarchal, imperialist system that they were originally formed to fight against. There's really no overlap in vision for society.
Okay, so we've laid out this picture. The GPUS is ideologically committed to eco-socialism, structurally pure in its rejection of corporate money, and sees itself as fundamentally opposed to both major parties and the system they operate within.
Right, which leads directly to that recurring narrative you hear in the media, especially during election years, that the Green Party is politically irrelevant, that they have lackluster performance because they don't win national elections.
Yeah, the spoiler argument, the wasted vote argument, all of that.
Exactly. But what's fascinating, and what the source materials really make clear, is that the GPUS itself actively rejects that definition of success. They don't accept the premise that winning national office is the only or even the primary measure of their impact.
How can they reject that? Isn't that the point of a political party?
Not entirely for them. This goes back to their origins, retaining that fundy movement DNA we talked about, especially the commitment to grassroots democracy and decentralization. Because of that, their core strategy isn't top-down, trying to win the presidency first. It has always been focused on building power from the bottom up.
Building from the bottom up? So what metrics do they use to measure success if it's not winning national races?
Local elected office, that's the key metric for them. The strategy is actually quite pragmatic in this specific sense. Win local races, get Greens into positions on city councils, school boards, county commissions, local planning boards, things like that.
And they have had some success there.
Yes. According to their own tracking, as of mid-2025, they reported having at least 163 Greens holding elected office in various positions across 21 states. And looking back since 1985, they claim a total of 1,582 wins in various local races over the decades.
1,582 wins. That's not insignificant at the local level. But why is winning, say, a school board seat in a small town seen as more valuable to their long-term strategy than running a high-profile presidential campaign that gets a lot of media attention, even if it doesn't win?
For several really important reasons, according to their perspective. First, it allows for the direct implementation, even on a small scale, of their core values and policies. A Green on a city council can actually push for municipal ranked choice voting, or advocate for creating a local public bank, or fight for stricter environmental zoning. They can make tangible change.
Okay, practical application. What else?
Second, at that local level, their biggest perceived weakness nationally, the no corporate money rule can actually become a huge advantage. They can run grassroots campaigns against local incumbents who might be clearly tied to, say, real estate developers or other powerful local business interests. Their clean money stance can be a real selling point locally.
Makes sense. People might trust them more.
Exactly. And third, these local wins create a crucial farm team. They build a bench of people who actually have experience holding office, dealing with budgets, working in government. These experienced local officials can then potentially run for state legislature or even federal office down the line with a proven track record. It builds capacity.
So local success is how they prove their real structure can actually function and win, just on a different scale. But what about the impact of their national campaigns? Even if they don't win, don't they exert pressure, push ideas into the mainstream? If the Democrats are, as they claim, constantly co-opting their best ideas like the Green New Deal, why would the Greens just disband and try to work inside the Democratic Party to push it further left?
That's the million-dollar question they constantly face, isn't it? And their answer, the rationale for continuing as a separate party, really lies in this idea of serving as an ideological incubator.
An incubator, meaning?
They see themselves as the organization whose job it is to develop and hold on to the pure, uncompromised, often eco-socialist versions of policies that the mainstream just isn't ready for yet. Think about single-payer healthcare, or the original, truly radical Green New Deal with 100% renewables by 2030 and public ownership, or massive cuts to military spending.
They believe these ideas only get discussed at all because they exist outside the mainstream, pushing from the left.
That's exactly their argument. Their rationale is that without the GPUS persistently advocating for the full-strength, undiluted version of these policies, the ideas would inevitably get watered down or co-opted into near meaninglessness by the time they reach the mainstream political debate within the Democratic Party.
So if the GPUS disappeared,
their fear, or their argument, is that the Democratic Party would simply drift back towards the center. The Green New Deal would become even more of a Wall Street version focused on corporate subsidies. Single payer would permanently fade in favor of maybe, at best, a weak public option that keeps the private insurance industry intact. They believe their radical purity provides essential external pressure that prevents even further dilution.
Which brings us back to what seems like their ultimate underlying mission. Just being a constant structural critique. They exist almost to prove that the current U.S. political system is fundamentally broken.
I think that's a fair assessment of their core function, yes. To be that permanent, unrelenting structural critique. They diagnosed the main problem as a corrupt campaign finance system dominated by a two-party monopoly.
And because of that diagnosis, they fundamentally reject the whole logic of voting for the lesser of two evils.
Absolutely reject it. They see that logic as a political trap, designed by the two major parties to maintain their power. They argue that voting for the lesser evil simply guarantees that no fundamental change ever happens, because you're always choosing within the confines of the system they believe is corrupt.
So if the fight isn't really Democrat versus Republican in their eyes, who is the real enemy? What's the real conflict?
They define the actual conflict not as the staged battle between the two major parties, but as a much more fundamental struggle. We the people versus corporate and wealthy elites.
And since both major parties take money from those elites,
a practice the GPUS categorically forbids for itself. They argue that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are structurally capable of truly solving the deep crises of climate change, economic inequality, or endless war. Both are compromised from the start, in the Green view.
So think about it this way. Their consistent failure to win major national elections isn't really a failure of their strategy.
It's almost the expected consequence, maybe even the necessary outcome, of adhering strictly to their principles. It's what happens when you run an explicitly anti-capitalist, no corporate money platform within a system completely dominated by capitalist funding and structures.
So the party doesn't exist primarily to win power within this structure.
It exists to challenge the fundamental legitimacy of that structure. For them to dissolve or to compromise on their core principles, like taking corporate money, wouldn't just be giving up, it would be a total strategic failure. It would be a capitulation, a validation of the very two parties of war and Wall Street that they were founded to oppose. In that sense, their persistence, even without national wins, is itself an act of ideological resistance. #tag outro.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive has really painted a picture of the Green Party of the United States that's far more complex than just seeing them as a marginal protest vehicle during elections.
Yeah, it's much deeper than that.
We're talking about an explicitly ego-socialist, libertarian socialist party, one that was literally forged in a schism over ideology versus pragmatism, a party structurally designed around this absolute, non-negotiable rejection of corporate power.
And whose own definition of success is measured very differently by local influence, by staying true to its ideology, and by its ability to act as this permanent external critic of the dominant political and economic system.
The GPUS seems ultimately defined by this conscious choice.
Yeah.
Purity. the fundee path, over the kind of pragmatism that might lead to more conventional success within the current system.
Exactly. Their persistence seems driven by this core conviction that any compromise with the current system is basically surrender. It guarantees, in their view, that the fundamental crises, ecological collapse, social injustice, will never actually be solved. So for them, maintaining their ideological structure, their purity, isn't just stubbornness. It's seen as a vital, non-negotiable prerequisite for enabling real systemic change somewhere down the line.
Which really leaves us, and you, the listener, with a powerful final thought to chew on. If the Green Party genuinely views its ongoing national electoral failure not as failure, but as a necessary success because it maintains the ideological purity of its anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist critique, what does that definition of success tell us? What does it imply about the current state of American democracy? And maybe more pointedly, about the real viability of achieving fundamental system change from within the established, corporate-funded structure? Are the Greens just holding a principled, perhaps futile line? Or are they, through their persistence and their failure, actually proving that the line between reform and revolution cannot truly be crossed from within the current system? Something to think about.